Around 2 months after the mansion incident that set the stage for Resident Evil 1, STARS officer Jill Valentine, the sole protagonist of the first game, has once again found herself in the spotlight. As the main protagonist in Resident Evil 3, it features a much larger array of enemies and zombies than other Resident Evil games up to this point, and also introduced an entirely new villain known as Nemesis, a tyrant creature with superior intelligence and enhanced physical dexterity, capable of chasing and antagonizing the player in ways that old Mr. X never really could. The undead inhabitants of Raccoon City are fearsome, grotesque, and deadly, and all while dealing with the constant pressure of the predator that is the Nemesis creature, you're going to be waging your own war with the lineup of Raccoon City's most detestable and terrifying brand of undead. Think you're ready? With the invention of the T-virus and the inevitable outbreak that succeeded it, came the opportunity to experiment with the virus and see how it affected other subjects, its bonding properties, and its potential for mutation. And after thousands of failed genetic experiments that were conducted with the virus by the Umbrella Corporation, they would eventually find success with a combination of reptilian DNA and a human embryo. The only thing left to do was administer the T-virus, and the first successful Hunter model was created, the MA121 Alpha, developed by William Birkin and Albert Wesker in the Arklay Research Facility. This would open the door for many other genetic experiments and mutations down the road. These hunters were also enemies that you faced in the very first Resident Evil, Resident Evil 0, and in Operation Raccoon City. The Alpha Hunter was the first of its kind, both a biological marvel of brilliance and a deadly superweapon, emblematic of fear and death. One single hunter was capable of taking out an entire platoon of armed soldiers and officers. Eventually, a large number of hunter clones in the Arklay Research Facility would be released from their cells by Albert Wesker to chase down and kill the remaining STARS officers. The MA121 prototype served as a biological blueprint and a reference point for almost all of Umbrella's future experiments and mutations. The Alpha Hunters were cloned and delivered en masse to other Umbrella Corporation facilities and were administered growth hormones that enhanced both their maturity and their intelligence. Battle and combat intel were taken from the Alpha Hunters, allowing Umbrella Corporation to push the MA121 into the next stage of their development. The Beta Hunters, a variant of the Alpha Hunters, are most of the ones that track you down throughout Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3. Prior to being transported to another Umbrella facility, the T-virus outbreak prevented the transport from ever leaving Raccoon City. As a result, a collection of Beta Hunters broke out and escaped to several areas across the city. Beta variants of the MA121 suffered from abnormal tumor growths on their head and upper body, making them pretty easily differentiable from the Alphas. These tumors were often extremely large to the point where it would obscure the hunter's vision, and as such they weren't nearly as equipped for combat. Despite being significantly quicker and more agile than their Alpha predecessors, one particular deviation from its original blueprint was the Beta Hunter's uneven arm size, as the Beta Hunter's left arm was around a foot or so longer than its right. After the T-virus was proven successful as a bonding agent between reptilian DNA and a human embryo, Umbrella Corporation became curious to test on similar animals to see if other strands of DNA were compatible with the agent. The corporation soon turned to amphibian DNA, and using a concentrated strain of the virus, the amphibious variant of the hunters, the MA124 Gamma, joined the fray soon after. The Gamma Hunter mutant resembled an extremely large frog with no eyes or teeth, but its mouth was wide enough to swallow a human whole. One major drawback to the Gamma Hunters was their inability to survive in dry or hot climates, and could only sustain themselves in watery areas or marshes. Although the bonding agent was compatible with amphibian DNA, and the experiment was technically successful, its overall lack of strength and speed proved the Hunter to be inferior in comparison to previous models. These drawbacks were enough for the Umbrella Corporation to decide that the MA-124 would not see past the experimentation stage. Due to its glaring weaknesses in both combat and intelligence, the corporation's research on the MA-124 was halted soon after its production. And the MA-124 variant was only one example of just how awry these experiments by the Umbrella Corporation could really go. After almost 2 decades of using their research to create hunters and subsequent hunter variants out of reptilian DNA, failed experiments that didn't prove adequate hosts for the virus were usually discarded in some way or fashion. Fleas, insects, and other various parasites would feed on the bodies of the discarded experiments, and what came of it was this incredibly large and malformed 6-legged insect known as a drain deimos. Taking its name after Greek mythos and lore, the bug's name Deimos was synonymous with the Greek Deimos, the god of terror and dread. Upon being infected by the virus, these insects would swell massively in size and in strength, so rapidly in fact that their skin and muscle tissue would sometimes struggle to keep up, evidenced by the insect's concept art showing various tears and imperfections in its flesh. An arguable predecessor to the Deimos parasite was one of Umbrella Corporation's experiments with insect DNA known as the Chimera, created by using the T-virus to establish a bond between insect DNA and a human embryo. The experiments that took place on human embryos would eventually return results, and so Umbrella Corp found and abducted homeless women into their laboratories and impregnated them to produce viable embryos. The drain deimos gets nutrition from consuming human brain fluid, and these parasites obtain said fluid by thrusting their fangs into the heads of their prey and leaching it from their spinal canal. These are, however, extremely rare sights according to Umbrella Corp, and are usually seen in really dark places and in habitats that sustain life for regular insects. They can crawl on multiple surfaces and even on walls and ceilings. The Chimera was proven to be especially deadly against humans because of their capability to pinpoint a human's jugular vein. But the Deimos parasite is not a byproduct of controlled experimentation, and so, even though it's considered a variant of the Chimera, it's also much less evasive and intelligent as a result. After the T-virus encapsulated Arklay County, the Raccoon City outbreak would ultimately catalyze a lot of uncontrolled mutations, parasites, and other animals that would wind up getting infected by the T-virus organically. And once the Arklay County water supply was contaminated, all means to effectively track and control the virus was lost, and infection cases increased astronomically in both humans and animals. This came to be known as the Raccoon City Incident, and with it came a grotesque array of terrifying abnormalities. One such creature was the Brainsucker. A close relative of the Deimos parasite, the Brainsucker's most notable deviation is its ability to stand with their hind legs and attack the player with one of its many limbs. It seems to have a slight advantage over the Deimos parasite in terms of intelligence, as it's able to attack with not only its claws, but also by spitting an extremely toxic and corrosive saliva while on the defensive. But while the Brainsucker does indicate a more intelligent life form, it is only slightly. Its nutrition remains largely the same as the Deimos, even practicing a similar tactic to get said nutrition, by stabbing their victims directly in the head and consuming the victim's brain fluid. And soon after the contamination of Raccoon City ran its course, other parasites inevitably came into contact with the infection. And it seemed the more of the virus they were exposed to, the more dramatically they would swell in size and in strength. Even earthworms under the soil weren't immune to this virus, as worms and other parasites feasted on decomposing corpses in the Raccoon City cemetery. The foothold of the T-virus would eventually extend to these creatures as well, and expectedly, some of these worms would mutate into ferocious and extremely ugly-looking beasts known as gravediggers, four-mandibled abominations that grew dramatically in size and in speed post-infection. Their four mouths enable them to burrow through soil underground with tremendous speed. Fortunately for its victims, these worms usually choose to stay in their preferred underground habitat whenever possible. When hungry, however, it doesn't seem to hesitate to dig its way to the surface for food. It can be extremely difficult to pinpoint its location underground, but it usually gives itself away by moving the above-ground objects that it runs into, a jiggling lamppost being the most common example. Once you hear an audio cue signaling its approach, be ready to take a few steps back, as it will likely spring up from the ground with lethal force and attack you. Some worms that were exposed to smaller and less overwhelming amounts of the T-virus didn't grow nearly to the size of the gravedigger, and instead only swell up to a fraction of the size of the former. The gravedigger's high exposure level to the virus is extremely uncommon, which means the sliding worms are far more commonplace. Can be good and bad for a multitude of reasons. Due to their massive size, the gravediggers usually lay eggs that can number in the hundreds. After a couple of hours, these eggs will hatch, and the gravedigger's larva will sprout forth with a nearly insatiable hunger for blood and flesh. The sliding worms, as they're called, aren't a huge threat by themselves, and in their larva stage, they're only recorded to be a maximum of 3 feet long. Thankfully, they don't share the strength and agility of its mother worm, but they become exponentially more deadly in groups. They seem small and unworthy of attention when they first hatch, but it doesn't take long at all for these parasites to reach full maturity, as some sliding worms have been reported to take as little as only a week's time to grow into a fully sized gravedigger worm. The incubation period for the T-virus infection largely depends on the strength of the victim's immune system. Some animals and humans that are only infected normally by the virus don't seem to have too many outstanding details outside of the average transformation. Most infected humans that experience the symptoms within a few days are transformed into zombies, just as humans that experience all the symptoms within just a few minutes. Most of the canine breeds infected in Raccoon City seem to have pretty normal transformations. At least as normal as turning into a zombie can possibly be. There's not much separating them from a normal dog aside from their enhanced speed and much more feral and unpredictable attitude. Some insects and arachnids infected by the T-virus don't even show signs of noticeable mutation outside of their size. Most arachnids don't seem to have been transformed that much after the incubation period of the infection. Most of the spiders in Raccoon City have only seen slight, insignificant changes, if any, to their former size. There are some lucky arachnids, however, that are still just large enough to be terrifying. Larger arachnids can be heard in smaller rooms with their unmistakable scuttering noises. After the contamination of Raccoon City, the T-virus infection produced more mutated creatures by accident, as opposed to a controlled experiment. The MA121 Hunter project was a massive breakthrough in biogenetics, but there was in fact a project in the making that showed vastly more potential. The Tyrant Project was a collaboration between both US and European branches of Umbrella to use a particular strain of the T-virus to create beings with superhuman strength and speed, and even with the mutation process, their intelligence would still be preserved. These super soldiers were known as Tyrants. and the first successful prototype wasn't produced until 10 years after the inception of the project. After successfully bonding the strain to subjects that showed signs of preserving intelligence even after the process, tyrants would soon begin mainline production. They could run, they could communicate, understand orders from superiors, and were even capable of using complex weaponry. By July of 1998, the archetypal T-103 Tyrant model was created, and not long after came the creation of other unique tyrants that saw use in Raccoon City, such as Thanatos, Tyrant C, and Tyrant R. And among these unique tyrants was the Nemesis-T, the flagship creation of the Nemesis project that involved the parasitic species capable of human-level intelligence and self-awareness. Specifically engineered by Umbrella Europe, this parasite was given the name Nemesis Alpha. Nemesis compensated his lack of strength and size in comparison to other tyrants with superior speed and intelligence. To prove its hunting capabilities, the Nemesis-T, nicknamed the Pursuer, was given an order by Umbrella to track down and kill any surviving STARS officers, including Brad Vickers and the main protagonist, Jill Valentine. Nemesis-T is a constant pressure in Resident Evil 3, and although his size isn't quite the average for most T-103s, Nemesis still measures about 1.5 times the size of a typical human, and his strength is still formidable. Nemesis is capable of tracking your movements as a player and using the environment to prevent you from escaping him. And if you want to give him the slip, running in a straight line without looking back is not going to be enough. Jill has several encounters with Nemesis that actually don't even result in combat. The Nemesis-T types are of the most intelligent tyrants ever to be in production by Umbrella, allowing them to watch from afar while assessing the situation, absorbing information, and discriminating between different targets. Although several Nemesis-T types were confirmed to be in production, this specific Nemesis-T that antagonizes you in Resident Evil 3 is the only one of its kind that has ever seen or experienced actual combat. With the significant use of tyrants being pushed into production and the T-virus contamination in full swing, Raccoon City became a breeding ground for terrifying mutations and cases of infection. Reduced to chaos, your only choice is to fight your way through some of Raccoon City's most nightmarish creatures, and a deadly bioorganic superweapon constantly closing in on your location. If you're new to the channel, feel free to follow me on Twitter, even though I'm a bit of a boomer when it comes to social media, but sometimes my opinions are funny, I guess. Thanks for tuning into The Forge. I'm Rusty, and I will see you next time. Take care.